Hi guys, welcome to the channel. My name's Chris Wright. I'm a landscape photographer working out of Granada, Spain. Now today is an auspicious day, and the reason it's an auspicious day is that 365 days ago I started work on the first of a series of videos that I made over the last year about DxO PhotoLab. And over the course of the past year, the channel has gained more than 2,000 subscribers, and I'm so grateful for the support. So grateful that if I could, I would come round to each and every one of your houses and shake you by the hand. The support has been fantastic, and it's way, way more than I expected, so long may that continue. So today what I wanted to do is a slight deviation from the normal videos. I wanted to compare DxO PhotoLab with three of the main rivals. So I'm going to do some comparisons around price. I'm going to highlight raw file conversion capability. I'm going to highlight color control, and we're going to talk a little bit subjectively possibly about some of the new features that PhotoLab has introduced over the past year. Now, all of these types of comparisons are invidious, and the reason is because you never can compare apples with apples, but I've tried to strip it down as much as we can. So the first thing I want to talk about is price. Let's get into it. Okay, let's talk about pricing, but before we get into the numbers, I just want to go through the target audience really for each of these packages. And this is subjective, but I think I'm pretty close to the mark with this. So Capture One started life as a studio tool. It supports tethering, and since the last probably 5 years, it's added quite a lot more into the processing part of it, and as such is probably the closest competitor for DxO PhotoLab. DxO PhotoLab does not support tethering, but it is easily of professional standard if you're doing landscape photography, if you're doing architectural photography or portrait photography. Any one of those is very well supported in DxO PhotoLab. Luminar NEO is different again. It's aimed squarely at the influencer market. It is very heavily dependent on AI and templates. So if you don't mind your photographs looking almost exactly the same as a million other photographers, Luminar NEO is a very small learning curve. It's point to click. It's probably very good for beginner photographers who don't want to go through the learning process that will enable them to find their own style and to process photographs according to that style. Lightroom and Photoshop, this is Adobe. They probably have about 80% of the market. The bundle is aimed at photographers of all levels. However, I would say that the learning curve is as steep as the learning curve for Capture One, and it's as steep as the learning curve for PhotoLab. Okay, so that being said, let's go down to the numbers. Capture One, the most popular deal is called the all-in-one subscription. It's €24.92 a month. So that's €299 for the year, and they expect you to pay the year up front at that price. There is a desktop-only deal with Capture One, which is probably appropriate for enthusiast photographers. And that is €18.25 a month. Luminar NEO, the current bundle, €317 per year. It's a subscription, and that equates to €26.41 a month. Lightroom and Photoshop, this is the Adobe offering. This is €12.03 a month, and that goes on forever. Now, all of the upgrades are included, but if you stop the subscription, you lose the capability to edit. So you're pretty locked in with Lightroom. PhotoLab, €229 lifetime license. Now, this means you can keep the software forever, but it stays at the level that you buy. Now, if you want to upgrade, you have a big reduction on upgrade pricing, and that is valid for 2 years. So you can either upgrade every year at a reduction, or you can upgrade every second year for a reduction. I'm thinking of enthusiast photographers when I say upgrade every second year, and that brings the cost of ownership down to €9.54 a month. Now, in fairness to Luminar and in fairness to the other vendors, I would also point out that functionality of PhotoLab is dependent in some aspects on also owning licenses for Viewpoint, which will automatically import the Viewpoint functionality into PhotoLab. And it's also dependent on FilmPack 7, which is another license, but that has the advantage of bringing luminosity mask functionality into PhotoLab. So there is an ecosystem. You get benefits from joining the entire ecosystem. The licensing model is the same throughout the ecosystem, i.e. you get 2-year upgrades, or you get the software for life. Okay, so in terms of marks for this, because of the 2-year upgrade cycle, I'm going to give PhotoLab 5 marks. It's the cheapest, accepting that you do the 2-year upgrade cycle. The next cheapest, I think, is Lightroom and Photoshop at €12.03 a month. But the big disadvantage with Lightroom is, of course, you lose the functionality completely. After that, I would go to Capture One. Capture One, I would say I'm going to award 3 points, and that's €24.92 a month. And lagging in behind in terms of cost of ownership is Luminar NEO, and that's €26.41 a month. Okay, so let's get on to some of the technical capability. Let's get on to raw processing. So in terms of raw processing, I don't think anyone would argue that DxO PhotoLab comes out top of the pile. The nearest competitor is Capture One, whose raw processing is very nearly as good. This is somewhat of a subjective opinion. I like the way that DxO raw processing comes out with a near perfect raw file. Capture One, very close. I've used both for a very long time. After that, I would say probably Lightroom is best. It's significantly worse than either Capture One or PhotoLab. And coming in behind is Luminar NEO. So that's the order, and what I want to do now is just let's have a look at what DxO PhotoLab brings to the table in terms of raw processing. Okay, so we've got a nice picture here, a nice autumn picture. It's been shot with a polarizing filter on the lens, so we've got a reasonable amount of colour in the picture to begin with. But what I want to talk about first is the issue of quality, and this is one of the reasons that I really like DxO PhotoLab, and it's one of the reasons that I think it's better than Adobe Photoshop insofar as photo raw processing goes. Now, you've got to realize, you've got to remember that to get to this point, what happens is that the raw file, as far as the human eye is concerned, is basically predominantly green, but also red and blue dots. And it's the photo processing software that puts together the picture that we recognize as a representation of what we saw when we pressed the shutter button. And this is different between various platforms. So what you find in DxO PhotoLab is slightly different to what you'll find in Adobe Camera Raw, slightly different again to Affinity. And for me, these differences really matter because it really feeds into how much latitude you've got with the processing, with adjusting the color, and so on. And my experience is that PhotoLab gives me more leeway, more ability to pull color out of the picture, and really more ability to make that picture something akin to the vision that I had with the picture. Okay, to get to the detail of this, we need to have a quick look at the presets panel, and what you'll see here is you've got general purpose presets. I'm not going to talk about the other presets because these are simply click and apply, and they're a great starting point for people who are not so comfortable with the detail. But I think in order to appreciate why PhotoLab is such a good raw processor, we have a look at this. So we turn the optical corrections on, and what we'll do is we'll have a look at the corrections that have been applied, which is this button here, in all of the panels. So in the light panel, we've corrected for vignetting. In the color panel, we've applied a working color space. So this is a good wide gamut color space. It's something, it's wider than sRGB, which is the default for export. However, it's better to work with the widest color space that you can get your hands on. If we go into the detail, we can see that lens softness has been compensated for. And we can adjust this should we wish to. Also, chromatic aberration's been corrected. In the geometry, we can see that we've corrected based on the DxO module, which describes the combination of camera body and lens that I've used to take this picture. So we wouldn't expect to find anything in the special effects, and obviously there are no custom corrections been made. So with that in mind, let's just have a look at the before and after. So we go to the compare toggle, turn that on. Now we're looking at the older version prior to the corrections being applied. You can see that the volume definitely has been adjusted, but you should also be able to see the corners are darker. And I don't think there was any chromatic aberration in this picture, but that correction has been applied. But you can see that there is already a substantial difference here. In terms of color processing, I use the DxO wide gamut color space for all of my photographs. And I find that this gives me richer colours, it gives me more realistic colours, and I find the controls to be more sensitive so that I can, effectively, I can bring more richness out of the raw files that are produced in DxO PhotoLab. Now, I think Capture One, in fairness, is very close. But I think that the DxO color controls offer more flexibility and they work more intuitively. It's very straightforward to use and straightforward to learn. Let's have a look at how that goes in action. The key to color processing, I think, is get the contrast correct first, because contrast has an effect on colour. If I manipulate the exposure slider, if I take the exposure down, what we can see here is that these autumnal colours are getting richer as well as darker. And this is something that plays right into the manipulation of highlights, shadows, and so on, all the way through contrast. So what I like to do is to try and get as much done in the light panel as possible before I go on to adjust the colours in the colour panel. So what I would typically do with a picture like this, I would turn on probably smart lighting. You'll see that smart lighting brings up the shadows down here. A little bit in the middle of the picture, but not noticeably in the sky. Okay, so I think this has been pretty well exposed, but one thing I will remark in passing is that if you were to do this job in Adobe Lightroom, you would probably try and select the sky. And in a picture of this sort of complexity with all these leaves around and the edges of the mountain and the snow up here, I'd say good luck with that. I think this does a better job than that particular Adobe layer adjustment. I have a particular problem with all sorts of selective tone adjustments because the reality is that they overlap. If I do mid-tones, okay, you can see the whole picture is getting brighter. Not as much in the shadows, but it still is getting brighter in the shadows. So it's basically creating a curve which is accentuating the middle. If I lift the shadows, you can see the whole picture is lifted. So this here, if I lift the blacks, really the blacks are doing a good job of lifting the shadows, if you like. So I tend not to use the selective tones at all. What I would do is put on Clearview Plus. Now Clearview Plus is very often a hammer cracking a nail. I find the sort of outer reaches of Clearview a little bit too much. So I'd back this off a little bit, but I would keep that. So take that off, and what we're seeing is we've got more contrast added to the mountain and the back of the picture. This is pretty much true to life. It's making, we've still got the slightly blue tinge in the distance. Take that off and you get a much more sort of uniform look, but I'd quite like this at a low level. Okay, now if I turn my contrast curve on, I get micro contrast immediately, and let's have a look and see what that does if we exaggerate it. Obviously here it's way too sharp, so I'd take that away. Put that back as it was, micro contrast. If we do contrast, okay, you can see this is now adding quite a lot of colour contrast to the picture. I still have the same issue, however, that it tends to work, it's a global control basically, and this is a sort of coarse level contrast control. My feeling is that we have more control over this. The other point about this is that if I put my contrast up, you can see that it does have an effect on the colour. Okay, so it's washing it out here and intensifying it here, and it's doing it right across the board, not just in the leaves, but also in the mountain, and so on. So I would leave that alone. Now, if I come to curves, this was a new thing that if I use the RGB curve, I'm pretty much doing what the contrast controls do. So I typically would drop my bottom end and increase my top end, and I've got more richness, and I can adjust the middle to just lift that picture a little bit if I want, but this is a taste thing. So take that off, you can see immediately that the colours have been changed effectively. If I use my Luma curve instead, I can drop the bottom and I can lift my mids, and I'm not substantially altering the colours here. So if I take that, go back to the RGB curve, if I turn this off, the Luma curve adjustment hasn't massively changed the actual colours. If we look at these colours here, it has very slightly, but not as massively as the RGB curve did. So I'm quite a big fan of the tone curve. And of course, I can now add a little bit of my actual RGB adjustments as well, and I can make this quite a lot richer. Okay. Now you also have presets here, and they will do a much stronger contrast, but I mean this begins to look like it's evening, and it wasn't. It was so I would stick with my contrast that I've got here. Okay, but so now if we go into the color curve, into the color controls, I'm going straight to the HSL controls here, turn on HSL, and let's have a look. So I want to make the sky slightly more saturated, and that's my blue here, so I'll just reiterate that by choosing the blue. There you go, slightly more saturated. And this is entirely realistic. If you look into the distance in a landscape, you will find that the blue tones are accentuated in the distance. And because this is an autumn scene, I want to also accentuate my oranges here. So let's pull these oranges up, pull the luminance up, and now we're getting a much richer palette. I can do the same with the yellows. And let's not forget the greens. So, okay, so that's generally my color control. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is noise reduction. This is the other thing that DxO are absolutely brilliant at. And this, to my mind, Adobe have made big improvements in Adobe Lightroom and Camera Raw. I still don't think they're as good as DxO PhotoLab. But let's have a look and see what this picture is going to look like with noise reduction applied. So what I do here is I put on the loop and drag that up over the thing here. And what we have with noise reduction here, there is not substantial noise in this picture. So high quality looks quite good. If I change that to prime, that's made a little difference, almost imperceptible. If I change it to deep prime, and I can go to deep prime XD2S, okay, and what I think here is that XD2S is, for this picture, which is well lit, XD2S is slightly too much. You can see this is looking, to my eyes, slightly over sharpened. There's a lot of detail, which perhaps too much. So I would take this back to deep prime. So looking at the stones here, and we can bring this up to 200%. If we want to, that to me seems a little bit overbaked. So I'm going to take that back to prime. You choose the noise reduction you need, and this is, I think, quite a big differentiator. So I'd be happy applying prime to this picture. I don't see there's any need for... So I'd be happy applying prime to this picture. I don't think there's need for deep prime or XD2S in this particular case. Plus side, if you like, of this is the sheer amount of control you've got over the noise reduction. Now, I really sort of almost regret that I didn't have a noisier picture to hand to show this in action, but you can see that you can affect luminance noise, chrominance noise, color noise, in other words, low frequency noise. You can remove dead pixels as part of this, and a quality called maze. And what maze is the it's the effect that one pixel has on neighboring pixels. So it's right down at pixel level, whereas contrast, you can imagine, is the level of shadow and light in areas of the photograph. This takes it right down to pixel level. So DxO noise reduction gives me exactly what I need. It gives me coarse-grained differentiation. I can choose between 4 different levels, if you like, of noise reduction, choose the one that's most suitable for the picture, and I can fine-tune the default settings affecting luminance, chrominance, low frequency noise, dead pixels, and maze at the using the sliders here. So very, very good. So in terms of raw processing, I've really taken the most important factors, or the factors that I consider to be most important. So these are noise reduction, it's the demosaicing process, bringing the picture into your editing environment, and color control. And I think those 3 things are what gives us the perfect or cleanest or most pristine raw file to work with. And I'll repeat the point I made earlier. If you start with a bag of hammers, i.e. if you start with a raw file that's defective, that's got all sorts of problems stemming from perhaps the lens or the camera or, you know, any other part of the process, then no amount of processing expertise is going to pull that back, and you're going to end up with something that is still a bag of hammers, albeit with lipstick on the outside. So it's that's the story. So I think for me, DxO PhotoLab is still the best raw processor. The competition has been making big strides, but then DxO have also. And taking the DxO portfolio as a whole, I think you have the best set of features, certainly outside of Lightroom, Photoshop. So I'd like to thank you all very much for watching the video. Hopefully it hasn't been too long. If you've got a moment, just drop down underneath and give us a like, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't been here before, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much, guys. Bye.